annual recognition of award winners. At this time, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Glen Daigger. Glen and I have been personal friends for quite some time. In fact, the first time I learned about the Academy was when he had Diplomat of Environmental Engineering on a PowerPoint slide when he gave a presentation. Many of us know Glen, know of his history with CH2. Currently, Glen is a professor of engineering practice at the University of Michigan. We all know that he is an internationally recognized expert in wastewater treatment and water quality management for municipal and industrial systems. He has tremendous expertise in biological processes. We're honored to have Dr. Daigger here with us today. Glen, the stage is yours. Thank you for joining us.
So thank you so much, Dan. That was, first of all, your overall presentation of the Academy was outstanding. And thank you very much for the kind words and for asking me to speak here about the Clean Water Act. So Clean Water Act, of course, it's 1972. In 1972, I was a junior in civil engineering at Purdue University, just beginning to decide to then focus on this emerging specialty of environmental engineering. So it was an interesting time in retrospect because I came in at that point, but this was a period where environmental engineering was transforming from sanitary engineering, as you described, and the environmental engineering profession as we know it was really being formed. But I would submit, in fact, I would strenuously assert that the Clean Water Act is the most impactful piece of legislation relative to clean water, not only in the U.S. but internationally. And I took the time a few years to go back and read the act, and what I found was really a forward-looking and inspirational document, even by my perspective of several years, really a couple of decades already past its enactment and implementation. So what I really want to do is to kind of hit some of the important points, but really tie how the far-sighted nature of that document has been so influential, not only here in the U.S. but on a global basis. So the Clean Water Act, the formal name is the Federal Water Pollution Control Act of 1972. It wasn't the first. There was the Public Health Services Act of 1912, the Oil Pollution Act of 1924, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act of 1948, and a Water Quality Act of 1965. What was one of the seminal aspects, though, of the 1972 Act? One of the seminal aspects of it is that it established nationwide standards. Prior to this, it was judged that the states had the purview for water quality, and that some of these acts encouraged states but didn't require them. And it was viewed that the waters of the states were the business of the states. So some clever legislators said, how can we approach this? And navigation. The federal government has and had then the responsibility for managing navigation. So that was the basis. So this act applies to navigable waters. That's a controversial thing. In fact, the ongoing discussions and controversy and so forth about waters of the U.S. is really what is the definition of navigable waters, and it says navigable and those affected by that There's those that think that we don't go far enough. There are those that think we go too far in terms of that definition, but very clever. The objective of the act was to restore all of the water, all of the navigable waters of the U.S. to a fishable and swimmable state. The goal was actually to eliminate discharges. And I think that was actually quite prescient and something that, as the profession, we've tended to push back on, I think, to our detriment. It applies to point sources, whether they be municipal or industrial, the two categories that were addressed first, to municipal non-point sources of pollutants into the waterways, but agriculture was excluded. Including agriculture was just a bridge too far in 1972, and it appears that it is in 2022. And that's an issue I'll touch on towards the end here. A fundamental concept was to establish uniform pollution control requirements that were enacted every place. And this was, in terms of implementation, was transformative. The idea, of course, is to eliminate pollution havens. If you wanted to develop your economy, be lax on environmental regulations was the idea, but no, we can't do that. So this leads to, for municipal treatment, secondary treatment as the technology requirement, for industries, for effluent guideline limitations, so uniform requirements for industry, and the definition of best available treatment, and the industrial pretreatment program, which has been so successful and so impactful in terms of controlling. And again, it was really the first large-scale effort of this type in the world, but it's been adopted around the world. This integrated approach is also something that's been adopted around the world. And for example, on the industrial side, the role of multinational corporations in terms of uniformly applying these standards has really made this into not just a US, but a national standard. The overall process involved these technology-based standards, that minimum that everyone needs to do, eliminating pollution havens. And then when that was insufficient, then water quality standards, quantitative water quality standards, the Gold Book was established, and each state had to adapt those as a minimum. And where that was not met, then additional controls of one type or the other were needed. This was related to designated uses, so fishing, swimming, water supply, and so forth, and put in place permitting requirements for the point sources and so forth to see that that these water quality objectives, that the intent anyway, that they would be achieved. Anti-degradation, also an important concept. If you look at the European Union in the late 80s issued the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, which is the moral equivalent of the technology standard throughout Europe. They followed that up a couple decades later with the Urban Water Directive, which is the water quality side of it. So you see how what the Clean Water Act did spawned the model that's used other places. There was an update in 1977, but the most significant one was the Water Quality Act of 1987 as an update. This formally recognized that we had waters that were not meeting these standards and established the 303D list, the list of impaired water bodies that we're still working on. It also formalized the stormwater regulations, the municipal separate storm sewer system regulations that are applied. So moving on to non-point source and agricultural point sources, which has been quite controversial, but at least as a step in terms of addressing agriculture. Out of this also came the total maximum daily load process, the TMDL process, again, which is emulated other places. What that involves is identifying the load that a water body can successfully process of a given pollutant, allocating that load to various contributors in the margin of safety. I've got a note here that says that there have been, first decade and a half, there were 60,000 TMDLs. But we're not done. The data are this, that about half of the streams and rivers, the flowing freshwater bodies, they're on that list. About 70% of lakes, ponds, reservoirs are not meeting criteria. About 90% of the ocean and the coastal zone. I think this just really represents, to a certain extent, the magnitude of the challenges that we have and are still dealing with. Funding, and this is really a misnomer. There are many that said, well, the federal government has funded so much of our water infrastructure. It is true that for about a decade and a half, the construction grants program provided significant funding, basically to ramp up the technology-based requirements, the secondary treatment. But even during that decade and a half period, it funded only about half of the spending, and it was an anomaly. So the financial support for clean water is largely at the local level. The federal intervention was just a short time. The 1987 Act also set up the Clean Water State Revolving Funds, which are in place today. These are loans, not grants, as the earlier. Then one other I'll mention is the biosolids. The 503 regulations were one of the first major risk-based sets of regulations, and of course applying to the residuals of wastewater treatment. We used to call it sludge. This created biosolids, and the idea that we need to control pathogens, we need to control chemical constituents, and put in place an approach, again, which is used worldwide. You can go to any country in the world, and they know what the biosolids regulations are. Some of the major successes beyond the items I've talked about here, toxics. In 1972, we had rivers that were burning. The Cuyahoga River, among others, which has been turned into folklore and songs. But so many toxics have been addressed. I think what's most important, though, is the idea of controlling pollution at its source and in a proactive fashion has been institutionalized. With all the pushback, we still do what is on the books, and it's been relatively uniformly implemented. We still have ongoing issues. Nutrients are certainly one of those. It's one which is proven to be very difficult to deal with, although we continue. And one of the issues there is that has not been resolved, but is whether we should establish numerical criteria for nutrients. It actually is happening at the state level in one way or the other, not at the national level, but it's happening. We hear about PFAS and so forth, but I would put this into a different category. I would characterize it as the ubiquitous presence of chemicals and the ubiquitous use of chemicals. PFAS is the one we talk about today, but we've had other chemicals in the past, and we'll have new chemicals. And wet weather, both certainly climate change is part of this, but it was a significant issue even before that. So we talk about things like sanitary sewer overflows and combined sewer overflows. We're going to be dealing with this probably forever within our profession. I will say that we need to also understand the difference between the legislation, which is the act itself, but the regulation. And I have to say that my own assessment is that we as a profession could have contributed more positively in terms of the regulatory side of this. Oftentimes we were pushing back when we shouldn't have pushed back. So in terms of, I think, a lesson learned going forward, that we should be more prepared to stand up for the environment rather than someone's pocketbook going forward. But seminal, transformative, written by a small group of legislators with, the aides are young people, but visionary, transformative, and still the basis for what we do in the wastewater management profession. So thank you very much for the opportunity to offer these thoughts. I hope I've generated some discussion that can occur, and I'll turn it back.
Thank you so much, Dr. Daigger. At this time, it's my pleasure to announce the winner of the Clean Water Act Award. The winner of this special award goes to Black and Beach and the Sacramento County Regional Sanitation District for their Regional San Echo Water ENR project. Back to you, Israel.
Thank you, Dr. Daigger, and congratulations to Black and Beach and the Sacramento County